Welcome, everybody. I'm Julie Wiskirchen from the authors team at Google, and I'm excited to welcome Chris Carlsson today. He's going to talk to us about his book, Nowtopia, How Pirate Programmers, Outlaw Bicyclists, Vacant-Lot Gardeners Are Inventing the Future Today. Chris is the executive director of the multimedia history project Shaping San Francisco. He's a writer, publisher, editor, and community organizer. He's edited 4 collections of political and historical essays. He helped launch the monthly bike-ins known as Critical Mass and was the longtime editor of Processed World magazine. Please join me in welcoming Chris Carlsson.
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Julie. It's really fun to come to Google. I feel like I'm going to have a really interesting conversation with you guys. I start out just briefly by giving you a little bit more background about myself. Then I read for about 7 or 8 minutes. Then I talk kind of open-endedly for about 30. The slideshow runs continuously behind me, so you'll get to see those images several times. And then I come back with a short conclusion that I read. So that's sort of the format, and then we'll throw it open, and you guys can beat me up or whatever you want to do. Processed World magazine was an important precursor to Nowtopia. I was a college dropout in late 70s, early 80s, and late 70s. And like many people with a college education, what did I really learn to do? Handle information. And so I ended up taking a job in the financial district in San Francisco. And along with many other people, looking around at each other, we realized that we had a lot in common, that we didn't really belong there, or so really we needed to make a living, so that's why we were there, so we did belong there. But the reality of the matter, and it turned out to be true for many people and continues to be true to this day, even maybe for some of you, that we live a bifurcated life. There's something that we do to make money, and then there's quite other things that we do to feel fully engaged and fully alive and fully involved with our creative capacities and with the world that we actually face, which often our work does not address directly. That may not be as true for Google employees as other people, but I suspect you'll find some commonalities with the point of view. So Processed World was about the underside of the information age, as told by the alienated wage slaves of the modern office and beyond, back long before the internet was a part of our lives. And one chapter I have in my book in Nowtopia is called The Virtual Spine of the Commons, and in there I do my own effort at a quick history of the internet, but also a real focus on my experience working as the mail secretary for community memory, which was a really early effort to create essentially what we now have that we commonly call the internet. And the internet was already existing, obviously, as ARPANET, et cetera. But really, the early people in the 70s didn't imagine that it would become this household device and everybody would have access. They were really afraid that it would be locked up and monopolized by large corporations and the military and the government. So they were working very hard to create this other system. So I've had this experience of watching the rise and fall of software companies way before the dot-com boom, and worked at a bunch of different levels of that kind of world, and had a great number of interesting experiences that will hopefully inform the conversation that we have together. But essentially, Processed World was a labor magazine. And so then from there, I ended up getting really involved in local history. You can go to foundsf.org and get a good look at our brand new edition of Shaping San Francisco that has just rolled out as a wiki. So I encourage you all to get a look at that. And of course, we're looking for high-skilled technical help. Anybody looking for a project to work on, we could use some help. We can talk about all that later. So let me just start right in. I'm afraid we've used up some of our hour, so I'm going to try to speed along here and keep it moving. So this is from the book, from the introduction to the book. I reached adulthood in a society bent on obscuring and denying class, but most of my life had strongly reinforced my sense that I live in a world not of my own making, and not under the control of anyone I knew. I don't conceive of classes changing with every $10,000 of more or less income. I share the skepticism of many people towards anyone who wants to draw edges too clearly around a given class schematic. Nevertheless, as a way of analyzing power relations in society, I find class indispensable. In analyzing work as the broad category of human life, class is a crucial component. Somehow, the system under which we live keeps expanding, keeps using the energy and goodwill we bring to our work lives to make a world quite different than one any of us would choose freely. How is it that so many of us go to work with the best of intentions and yet find our efforts contributing to a world that is brutalizing so many? The vast majority of us have to sell ourselves to a paid job in order to survive, and it is precisely at that point of sale that we relinquish control over our lives. Once sold, hired, we must do as we are told, and if we don't, we are likely to be fired and cut off from the income on which we depend. This is partly ameliorated by self-employment and cooperative arrangements, but we still lack control over the deeper questions surrounding the aggregate division of labor in society. how and why resources are dedicated to some activities and not others. The day-to-day loss of power embedded in the wage relation is the starting point of class division. But it has become more confusing and opaque with the expansion of the social factory, a system of capitalist reproduction in which almost anything we do can be a source of someone else's profits and a reinforcement of our own alienation and powerlessness. In a society that perpetually celebrates itself as democratic, public discussion about our greatest public secret, work, is rarely heard. There isn't any public control over the fundamental decisions that shape our lives, whether it be what work is done, how work is done, who we will work with, or more broadly, the nature of scientific research, the types of technologies we might choose or refuse, depending on a public airing of the consequences of various choices, and so on. It is in this deep separation that class arises, the separation of most of us from the world we reproduce with our shared labor. This understanding of class has the additional effect of undercutting the age-old personalization of class antagonism, since in fact there are very few people who have any real power over the issues I listed above. As some of my informants have argued, class is embedded in a system of social life, and the capitalists who make the big decisions about development, technology, science, etc., are very small in number. Many of their decisions are determined by their own imprisonment in technologies and investments that precede their brief occupation of the seat of power. The opponent we face is much more often a faceless, undemocratic economic system than a cigar-smoking industrialist, though, of course, there are still such people, too. Class denotes a position in the division of labor, or the separation of responsibility from execution. Once employed, very few people really get to make meaningful choices, even if they're well-paid and socially valued. Nowtopia is a book about a new politics of work. It profiles tinkerers, inventors, and improvisational spirits who bring an artistic approach to important tasks that are ignored or undervalued by market society. Rooted in practices that have been emerging over the past few decades, Nowtopia's exploration of work locates an important thread of self-emancipatory class politics beyond the traditional arena of wage labor. More and more people, recognizing the degradation inherent in business relations, are creating networks of activity that refuse the measurement of money. Dispersed and virtual networks have grown thanks to the spread of the internet and other telecommunications technologies. New kinds of families based on shared values, alternative living arrangements, and non-economic relationships are growing within the old society. Nowtopians are establishing or reanimating human communities, networks, and circuits from which new initiatives will continue to emerge well into the future. These new communities manifest the efforts of humans to transcend their lives as wage slaves. Tentatively, they embrace a culture that rejects the market, money, and business. Engaging with technology in creative and experimental ways, the Nowtopians we meet here are involved in a guerrilla war over the direction of society. In myriad behaviors, people are appropriating their time and technological know-how from the market, and in small, invisible ways, are making life better right now, but also setting the foundation, technically and socially, for a genuine movement of liberation from market life. These practical acts can best be understood in terms of class and ultimately a classless society. As capitalism continues its inexorable push to corral every square inch of the globe into its logic of money and markets, while simultaneously seeking to colonize our very thoughts and control our desires and behaviors, new practices are emerging that are redefining politics and opening spaces of unpredictability. Instead of traditional political forms like unions or parties, people are coming together in practical projects. Rarely do these new configurations emerge from specific workplaces or neighborhoods. Just as rarely do the individual participants conceive of their projects exclusively in political terms, mostly because the idea of politics has been colonized by the bizarre advertising campaigns of ritualized electoral democracy. The day-to-day issues about how we live, what we do, how we define and meet our needs tend to be understood as beyond or outside formal politics. However, as we shall see, all Nowtopian activities are profoundly political. Acting locally in the face of unfolding global catastrophes, many avoidable were we to really try, friends and neighbors are redesigning many of the crucial technological foundations of modern life. These redesigns are worked out through garage and backyard R&D programs, among the friends using the detritus of modern life. Our contemporary commons takes the shape of discarded bicycles and leftover deep fryer vegetable oil of vacant lots and open bandwidth. Really free markets, anti-commodities, festivals, and free services are imaginative products of an anti-economy. provisionally under construction by freely cooperative and inventive people. They aren't waiting for an institutional change from on high, but are getting on with building the new world in the shell of the old. Precisely because so many people find their work lives inadequate, incomplete, degrading, pointless, stupid, and oppressive, they form identities, communities, and meaning outside of paid work, in spaces where they are not working class. It is in these activities that people who are reduced on the job to mere workers become fully human, fully engaged with their capacities to create, to shape, to invent, to cooperate without compulsion, to bring consciously to life relations, objects, and activities of their own choice. The semi-conscious war between these life-affirming, self-emancipating behaviors and the coercive domination of money, property, and survival amidst contrived scarcity is the core investigation of this book. So, with that out of the way, obviously I talk about class, and that's not a real common thing in the United States these days. And I want to give you a quick kind of synopsis of the frame of reference that I'm coming from. It's an Italian autonomist idea known as class composition. And if you take, I'll try to give you a quick handle on it. If you think of that, any given moment in history, this one or anyone in the past, and you just take a snapshot of everything everybody's doing everywhere. So all the physical roads and buildings and wiring and everything else, and all the different ways that the society's been set up. And then within that, there's all these different jobs and all these things people are doing. So that's the technical composition of the working class. And then there's also a social composition of the class, which tends to be what we do for each other. The ways we get space, steal time, help your friend go and take care of their sick child. All these little ways that we take care of each other. Sometimes it was, in other moments in history, more commonly thought something you would do is start a union, et cetera. So there's ways that people find points of resistance within their work lives. And that's essentially the social composition of the class. Now, class, just to use the term at all, is problematic in the United States because here, everybody's in the middle class, right? If you're not pushing a shopping cart down the street looking for aluminum cans or riding in a Lear jet, you're in the middle class. John McCain thinks you're in the middle class if you're making $4.5 million a year. So the concept of class has kind of lost any meaning for us. Everybody's in this weird big middle. And what I'm arguing is a kind of expansive idea of the working class, which is to say it doesn't really matter if you're making $18,000 a year or even $118,000 a year. We're still wage slaves. We have to do our work under somebody else's agenda, and we go to work every day and we do what we're told, and we don't have that job. And it's that kind of relationship to our own labor that I think is fundamentally at fault in the way we end up reproducing a world over which we really have very little to say. So if you take this class composition idea, then there's these cycles of composition in this theory, in which you have a moment where you reach a certain point of capitalist success and profitability, and then the people who work within that technical composition find ways to resist, find ways to put up obstacles to further accumulation. And it slowly contributes to the erosion of profitability. There's also some internal contradictions in capital, which if you're a student of Marx, you can talk about at some length. But what I'm trying to do here is more situated in terms of what we do and what we can do to actually make a life much better than it is today. So go back to the late 60s and early 70s, the last really easily recognized time where profitability broke down across the planet. There's a lot of reasons for it, but one of them was there was a giant explosion of social movements in most parts of the earth. And that explosion was part of what was eroding profitability to the point that Nixon had to break, had to break with the gold standard. There was a sudden radical increase in the price of oil. All these things were the beginnings of a counterattack because on an aggregate scale, capitalism recognized that it had to restructure how it was producing everyday life to restart a process of capital accumulation after it had broken down, largely through social opposition. And so from that time forward, you have the decomposition of the class. That is to say, all the people that had figured out ways to resist and increase the welfare state and increase union strength and higher wages and working less and slowdowns and all these kind of things that were going on during that period of history became difficult to do when the tide turned and when capital started that attack. So suddenly, scarcity and fear was reinstilled into the working class of the United States because the price of oil doubled overnight. I remember being in my high school classroom in the 70s and seeing everybody lined up across the street at the gas station trying to buy gas for 70 cents a gallon. Oh my God. It was twice as what we were used to paying, so it was very shocking at the time. But that goes forward from there, and you have this, the inner city of many big urban areas is totally gutted through landlord arson. Some of it happened even earlier with the social protests of the late 60s when cities were burned to a great extent. And so you have this kind of hollowing out of urban life. You have the breakdown of neighborhoods, the breakdown of workplaces. And so all the whole phenomenon of the Rust Belt, the rise of the Rust Belt, is an example of this sort of restructuring of the economy on a global scale. And now we just kind of glibly, oh yeah, globalization, that's just been happening. That's how it is. But it's actually a series of deliberate choices made to try to get the upper hand again on the class, the working class broadly understood across the planet. And so profitability was reestablished over a rather long 10 to 15-year period there from the early 70s into the early 80s. And from that time forward, our lives got harder and harder. They've just been going faster and faster and faster, and this weird frenzied speed up. There used to be an 8-hour day. It was the norm. How many of you have an 8-hour day here at Google? Probably not that many. And it's just gone. We don't even think it's normal anymore. And yet it was an urgent battle for decades and decades of world history to get the 8-hour day and to reduce work life and try to make it something where we would have enough life outside of that logic of the economy where we could be fully human. So this speed up that has come from the decomposition of the class is part of this world we're living in, and the fragmentation, so that we don't know our neighbors. We don't know the people we work with most of the time. Maybe some of you have more stable work life here and you know that your people that you've worked with for years now, but let's face it, the average person out there with a job is going to be there for 6 months to a year, maybe not that much longer now since there's this huge wave of destruction going on. But the kind of relationships that once made it possible to organize and to resist and to offer a different agenda for our lives depended on trust, and that trust depended on long-term relationships, and we don't have them. We're all in a frenzy, moving from job to job, from place to place. And this is an example of this sort of, or a manifestation of this broad breakdown of the class. So the big picture of this story in the book is that I'm arguing that we're at this moment of where it's starting to recompose. That is to say that a lot of us, with whatever our jobs are, whatever our skills are, whatever our income is, are deciding to be engaged in projects where we start to meet each other again and start to build trust and start to be sort of rooted in specific activities and in specific places. And so this kind of recomposition that we're engaged in, pretty unconsciously to be honest, is showing up in these interesting behaviors. And I've got a chapter on vacant-lot gardening, outlaw bicycling, the free software movement, biofuels from the bottom-up grassroots biofuels movement, even Burning Man. And I'll talk a little bit about those all in turn in a minute. So one of the key characteristics of all these different kinds of activities is the DIY phenomenon, do it yourself. And so you see, a lot of people now want to grow their own tomatoes. They want to fix their own bike. They want to have some kind of control over the basic needs of their lives in a very simple, in fact, mundane way. Big deal, like grow your own tomatoes, big deal, right? But if you start doing it in a community garden where you meet other people who are making similar decisions and you start having relationships with each other, something else is growing there besides tomatoes. Some kind of human communities, things that we all pretty much crave because of how radically they've been destroyed over the last 35 years of globalization, capitalist recomposition and development. So this DIY phenomenon, I'm going to flag it quickly as the sort of little activities of our daily lives, but I want to mention that it's also a broader impulse that a lot of us are involved with. And you can go back to the 60s again for a really good example, which is the women's health movement, self-care phenomenon, which sort of has its Bible in the book, Our Bodies, Ourselves. But up until that time, there was never such a thing, of women really banding together to learn about physiology, to learn about reproduction, to really figure out how to provide each other with simple medical services that the medical system was not doing. And so you had women meeting in collectives and in affinity groups and in circles and talking to each other and saying, oh, we need to start a clinic. And now we have these women's clinics all over the country, in most parts of the urban, at least the urban part of the country. And it's crucial for the fact that medical systems had to evolve and change. And now we have, of course, the rise of many other forms of alternative medicine. Sometimes you might consider them quackery, but in any case, the openness that has been produced by this impulse from below by women organizing around medical issues is really an important example of a broader phenomenon of do-it-yourself, of refusing the expertise that says, we know it all, we've got all the answers, you just sign up with our bureaucracy and we'll take care of it. And the women in this country said no, and they started doing something different. It was partly because it was illegal to get an abortion, and that really fueled that as well. But it's gone on well beyond that. Even after Roe v. Wade, we still have a big, huge women's healthcare movement throughout the country. Another really important example that's in the same realm is the anti-nuclear movement of the 1970s. I always find it a little bit odd to have to talk about it because we have to do it again. They're going to start the whole thing up again now. So this idea that nuclear is going to be some sort of a solution for global warming is really a travesty. And we had to teach ourselves about this 35 years ago. A lot of us, I was just coming out of college in the mid-70s, and me and many thousands of other people decided to take it upon ourselves to learn from people who were essentially anti-professionals, people who had been trained and skilled in physics and energy production, et cetera, who had taken it upon themselves to start helping other people learn that there's something really crackpot about a completely toxic process where you mine this stuff, uranium, and you transport it hazardously, and you poisoning people all along the way, and then you process it and cause more mayhem and waste. And then you take that final product and you put it in a nuclear power plant. What do you do with it? You boil water to turn turbines with the steam. And then you take all this poisonous stuff out and you have nothing to do with it because they've never solved the waste problem. And this is considered a good solution somehow now for global warming, which is just beyond comprehension to me. So that's another example, though, of a really broad movement that became a strong political movement in our culture that still influences a lot of things going on today, of this self-taught energy politics. We had to learn it from below and teach ourselves. Recently in the Bay Area, we had another example of this happen where the governor of California, the Terminator himself, decided that we were going to spray aerial pesticides all over the entire 9-county Bay Area because of a supposed infestation of the light brown apple moth. Well, there apparently is not such a thing. There's entomologists from Davis that said that's a crock. So luckily we had some professional support who just chose to break with their professional creed, which is you don't do that. With your boss, the state of California governor, says there's a problem, your job as a professor at the university is to bolster that argument, not to undercut it. But these guys thought for themselves and refused to go along with it. But more importantly than that was what preceded their decision to go public with what they knew, which was a giant social movement in the streets even. People were organizing door to door. Moms with babies were saying, what? You're going to spray me and my baby? I don't think so. All kinds of people with chemical dependencies and other kinds of issues around that in the Bay Area, which is a pretty strong community as it turns out, were up in arms and just said, no, we're not having it. You can't spray us. And then of course the argument was, oh, nothing to worry about. 90% of the material of what we're going to spray is inert. And then they started research. The people from below said, no, let's find out. Let's go and look at what you're actually going to spray. It turned out not to be true. Of course, a lot of it's toxic, known pesticides with known carcinogenic properties. So we have this culture now that pretty frequently is able to rise up from below with a counter-hegemonic logic, if you will, another way of thinking and acting that doesn't just accept expertise as always having the final and the right answer. And this takes a couple of parts. One is just a kind of grassroots sensibility that mistrustful of authority, very healthy mistrust. And then we have the rise of sort of a movement against professionalism from within professional ranks. And so I have a whole chunk of my book in there about that, but I don't want to spend too long on that part of it. But I'd say that that's an aspect of this new sense, broader sense that I have of the working class, which are the déclassé professionals, people who refuse to just be silent. Because a big part of the professional creed is you do your job. And if you bring politics into it, it's unprofessional. And that's wrong. It's wrong for all of us, and it's wrong for the individuals. And it's been great to see how many people are willing to rise up against that. So to bring Marx up for another half a second, there's a whole concept that he put out in the 1870s known as a general intellect. And that idea of his was that all the physical machinery, roads, buildings, et cetera, of our culture was essentially a product of the general intellect. It's what represented that which we have all done derivatively and cooperatively over time, maybe under heinous conditions, but nevertheless, all of us pulled some part of that together and produced it. And at any given moment, that's what's out there. But it's under the logic of the dictatorship of capital, how that continues to evolve. And what we see with both these broad social movements that resist the sort of logic of expertise and top-down organizing of our lives around technological issues, and these kind of everyday activities to choose to ride a bike, to choose to garden and grow your own food. These little things like that are really crucial because we're maybe the first time in history in a meaningful contest over the direction of the general intellect. That is to say, the world we make together. We can actually push it in a new direction, and we really haven't taken that up forever. The labor movement abdicated on this decades and decades ago. It decided it's never going to talk about the division of labor or why we do what we do or how we do it. It was going to just take a job and fight for rights and better money, but nothing more. And the problem now, it's pretty self-evident, is that most of the work we do on the planet, a great deal of it, is a huge waste of time at best. And another huge chunk of it is actually destroying the planet. And we have to stop doing it. Like, that's the task at hand today, is to stop doing all the stupid work we do and start doing the work that matters, because there's a huge number of things that we know we have to do. We have to reinvent how we grow food. We have to reinvent how we deal with water, transportation, communications, et cetera. And actually, I think Google has an important contribution to make to that. So the general intellect argument then, all this stuff is obviously hyper-simplified in oral presentation, and you should read the book to get the full effect. One of the best examples of an emergent science, counter-science, if you will, and I actually have a chapter called Contesting the Evolution of Science, is permaculture. And permaculture started in Australia, officially the name anyway got coined down there back in the 70s as a neologism of permanent in agriculture. And it starts with this whole kind of self-teaching process. And there's all these people get involved with the ideas of it. And permaculture it kind of needs a huge, long explanation. You can take a 2-week course and get certified in it, so I can't give you all that today. But there's 11 basic principles, and a couple of them, for instance, are just to think in terms of the cycle, not having a linear thing where you start growing, you start producing a product or whatever it might be, and you go through a series of steps, and you end up with this huge pile of waste at the end, and there's no sense that that is still part of the system, and it needs to be worked out. And so permaculture is very much about thinking in whole systems and loops. Another place that it likes to look at is the edge, where the ocean meets the shore, where the river, riparian habitat meets the plains or the forest, what have you. Those areas of meeting are really rich. It's where the most biodiversity is, the most ecological abundance tends to emerge. And if you think about it socially, those edges between the margin and the mainstream are also the areas of greatest creativity and interest to a great extent. So permaculture is a really fascinating topic. Again, could go on about it a long time, but I just want to flag an interesting loop that goes back 400 years, because one of my I'll tell you the bigger argument in a second, but going back 400 years, there was a moment back then when, for the first time, human beings started to draw pictures, really perfect, accurate pictures of the human anatomy or plant life. And those people that did it were like Da Vinci or Duret, some of these famous artists. But they didn't do it because they were artists. They didn't do it because they were painters who were getting paid to be painters. They did it because they were participating in a broad social debate that was emerging at the end of the Middle Ages around what was known then as natural philosophy, and today we call science. And so they saw themselves as contributing to that. And the way they saw themselves as contributing to it is their major activity was to be reading the book of nature and essentially reporting on that as a way of getting effects, of learning how to actually be engaged with the world around you in a more meaningful and effective way. And so interestingly, permaculture, to a great extent, repeats that same rhetoric. It says it's based on reading the book of nature and trying to adapt human behavior and human productive behavior especially to the logic of ecological reality, to a way that we're working with that logic instead of always against it. So there's something kind of exciting about that, because if you think about that and you sort of put it together with the Marxian moment and then this larger issue of science and technology and a rather large, deep shift going on, I like to argue that we're living through an epistemological shift. Epistemology referring to how we know what we know. And today we know the world much differently than we knew it even 20 or 30 years ago. The kind of common sense that a lot of us have in our daily lives that we know we have to figure out how to work, in that ecological logic. We have to recycle. It's a simple one. We have to reduce car use. There's all these different ways that a lot of us have made small decisions that are helpful but not getting there yet, but are aspects of a knowledge that we have, a new way of knowing our lives and knowing our lives on the planet. But this new way of knowing is not showing up politically. Like, you would never know that there are so many people making these deep changes if you relied on the rhetoric of politicians or the kinds of issues that rise to the surface in what passes for politics in the United States. Nor would you get it from the corporations, who are involved in a great deal of greenwashing, but for the most part aren't really making any substantive changes at all in how they go about reproducing our lives with our unfortunate complicity. So permaculture then is just an aspect of this larger logic in which we are contesting the entire direction of society, and the whole notion of what the boundaries are between life and not life are up for grabs. Even when you go to the advanced physics now, they don't know. Molecules are vibrating all over the place. They don't know where the edge is any longer. So there's a lot of interesting things to get involved with there. There's a bunch of that in that chapter. But I'm going to keep going to keep it quick, because otherwise we'll run right out of time. Urban gardening. So the phenomenon of urban gardening is one of the best examples of this going on. Long history behind it. We've always grown food outside of our houses. It's just a normal human activity, and it's actually a good example of how capital is a predatory system that takes normal human behavior and turns it into commodity relations and tries to reduce it, our work and our activities to that kind of logic. But the recent rise of urban gardening has interesting roots in the recent past as well. You go back the 19th century, there was this kind of movement. It was the Gilded Era, and so wealthy people would look at these starving people around them that had no safety net and said, oh, you should lift yourself up by your bootstraps. Go take that little plot over there and grow some food. You can take care of that part of your needs. And so that started somewhat philanthropically or condescendingly, if you like, in that period. And then it kind of disappeared again. But then World War I came around. The government gave a big push for urban gardening, and tons, I mean, hundreds of millions of tons of food and hundreds of millions of dollars of food was produced in urban gardens during World War I to support the effort. And then that was redoubled again in World War II during the Victory Garden phenomenon. In San Francisco alone, we had 70,000 Victory Gardens. And they were in public parks, they were in people's front yards, they were even in little medians in the middle of the streets. And in the end of World War II, 40% of the fresh produce being consumed by Americans was being grown in urban gardens. Right now, Shanghai gets a huge percentage of its fresh produce out of urban gardens, even though it's probably one of the most polluted cities on the planet. So it's really possible to do. You can imagine how much further it could go. And then what you find then is in the late 60s, again, this sort of moment where a lot of this stuff gets a really renewed impetus. There's a seizure of what's known as People's Park in Berkeley. And one of the first things that the seizers do is they jump the fence and they dig up an area and they start planting an organic garden. And of course, at that point, you had the several years of people being freaked out by chemically soaked food, Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring, et cetera. So this movement then took off from there, and people started really going back to the land in some respects, but also just where they were, going into urban gardening and doing organic farming as much as they could. And now we, of course, have this nice in-house restaurant here to eat in every day with lots of healthy food, which is very much of a product of social struggles that preceded our moment. People fought really hard to create this other way of dealing with food, and it's still growing. And it's still being resisted tooth and nail by these giant agribusiness interests who control the federal government's agricultural budget and priorities to this day. But the urban gardening movement then takes on a lot of interesting social moments too. You have you recall my brief simplified overview of decomposition of the class. You know, you have all these cities in the East especially, but even to some extent in San Francisco, they get kind of hollowed out in the late 60s and early 70s. There's all these empty lots left. And then there's a movement, often women-centered and women-led, to reclaim those rubble-strewn lots from the junkies and the violence, to create a space where they could re-inhabit their urban environment for themselves. And these are, you know, men are off in Vietnam or broken in one way or another, and they do it themselves. And so they take back all these places, like in New York City and in Philadelphia and Baltimore and other cities around the East, and they start to tear up the concrete and the rubble, planting gardens, creating a place where grandparents could be with the kids, where they could grow some fruit and grow some community, actually, as much as anything else. And so there's something really beautiful that happens, and it keeps going. It goes on all the way till the 1990s in New York. In the case of New York, it's kind of dramatic and quintessential example of what happens is that Giuliani becomes the mayor, and he just, you know, this is right after the wall's fallen, early 90s, and he's like, wait a minute, that's communism. You can't be using all these lands like that. We need to turn that back into private property. This is not a situation where you can just have open commons like that. And so he starts a process of turning those gardens, some of which were quite beautiful, full of art and amazing growing things, into condominium development opportunities. And there's a huge social war in New York City during the 1990s. And he's partially successful. He gets rid of some of the most beautiful gardens that are actually gutted and bulldozed with heavy police and sheriff involvement. But a great number of them are saved. The Trust for Public Land steps in and buys a bunch, and then Bette Midler starts a new organization that buys a bunch more. So there's still over 1,000 gardens in New York, and they're producing thousands of tons of food every year, and they're feeding lots of people. And so there's a broad embrace that's really starting to be pretty deep and consolidated. We have about 120 gardens in San Francisco that also are growing a great deal of food. Some of them are pretty large. You probably saw some pictures go by. I guess it went off. Huh. Okay, sorry about that. Shouldn't have gone off. In any case, the gardening movement suffers one great problem, which is that it tends to have this great and somewhat naive, beautiful thing of thinking like, oh, we can recreate urban gardens here. This is easy. We can actually just restart a process of a new commons. But it's not common land, it's private property. And so without facing that drama, that what happens is that it's fine when the place is abandoned and nothing's going on. But later, when the property owners come back or the politicians come back into the picture, they go, oh, that's really nice. You've gentrified the neighborhood. You know, all these people are moving in because they like the gardens. They like what's happened there, the recreation of community. And the people who did all that work, sweat equity to create that sort of basic restructuring of their communities, are out of luck because they don't own those lands. And so somehow this fundamental private property institution in our society gets in the way rather dramatically But it's an interesting place where the contest over the shape of urban life and urban space goes on. Another one that I've been very involved in that I'm very interested in is what I call the outlaw bicycling subculture. It's not really outlaw. It's just like we don't like to wear helmets. We don't stop for all the red lights and stop signs if there's no cross traffic. We just keep going, things like that. It's really hardly more than scofflaw. But the real story is that we're recreating a life in the city that's much more direct. We're out on our bicycles, we're meeting each other, we're going face to face, having discussions about the world around us. We're not just in a car getting the propaganda. We're actually ascertaining the real world around us directly through seeing it and through communicating with people that we can just pull right over and talk to. You can't just pull right over and talk to somebody when you see them on the street in your car. So the bicycling movement has all these different aspects of it. One of the most famous ones that I've been quite involved with is called critical mass. And it's a long story about that, which I won't go into in length, but just to say that critical mass is a monthly phenomenon in over 300 cities around the world now. And it started in San Francisco in 1992, and it just spread itself all over the place through what we call xerocracy, where anybody could be a xerocrat because you've all got copying machines on the job, so all you got to do is take advantage of that useful resource and start making flyers and hand them out to the people who ride bikes like you do and convince them to meet up with you once a month in what we know is an organized coincidence and ride home together. Why not? And once you do, you've filled the streets with bikes and you've displaced the cars. You actually are filling up the city with a completely different kind of life. And from that time forward, you start having these conversations. You meet people, you're rolling, you've seized the streets. It's totally outside of the law. The law doesn't like it, of course. Many places like New York City and other places, they've been very violent and have attacked it. We got attacked in 1997 in San Francisco. But this thing the phenomenon is so important because what does it do once you've tasted it? It's completely altered your imagination forever about what city life could be like. You can never see that moment of rolling down the street in the same way again. You've been in a crowd of wonderful people. You've met new people you've never met before. You've had conversations you never expected. You've heard things you never heard. You've smelled things you never smelled because you're always in a car or in a bus in some cases. So the bicycling movement has been very important for reshaping a lot of practical thinking about how we might re-inhabit urban life. And of course, it's contesting the use of city streets in a similar way. So when I think about the farming possibilities of urban farming and the gardening movement and the bicycling movement, both of them have some interesting crossovers. There's lots of individuals who are in both. And they also are really kind of our chance to think about how much different it could be. We could be having urban food forests. I mean, it's kind of like we ought to get on with it. We really need to start thinking about how we're going to get our food because, you know, mass urban or mass capitalist agriculture is on the verge of collapse. It has been for a while, and it looks more and more dire as every day goes by. So this kind of grassroots movement towards these practical activities we got to be really excited about. I'm going to just I'm looking at the clock, so it's kind of pushing me into being really horribly oversimplified here. But the software movement, all of you guys are involved in software, I suppose, in some way or another. And I call it the virtual spine of the commons. And it's kind of a long story. I'm sorry the slideshow hasn't gone through because you would have seen all these guys over and over again going by, but somehow it gets tied up here. The virtual spine of the commons to me is the possibility, really, that's built into what the internet is sort of and sort of isn't yet. But it could possibly be a way for us to really manage our lives together from below without all these tedious old hierarchies and ways of doing things that we've tended to live with for all too long. And what's happened, of course, is the rise of free software has had a lot to do with a lot of people taking their time to do it. You know, it's just a huge effort to make these things and make them go. And they become resources for people to do various types of social activities with. So one guy that flies by in the slideshow eventually is named Guillermo Payet, who started a thing called localharvest.org, which has been an interesting place for farmers to actually meet up with other farmers and other consumers directly. They just cut out the middlemen entirely. And it really helped the sort of local food movement get off the ground in many places where it was having trouble. And so there's these kind of ways that people are able to use these resources for political movements and political groups and practical things like alternative ways of doing food and agriculture as well. And so that's, you know, part of the use of it, but there's also the struggle over the logic of it. And so we're all, you guys are in the middle of that one on an everyday basis, whether you're thinking about it or not. And this notion that we've all had our minds actually shaped much more in a deep way towards the notion that everything we do is fundamentally collaborative. Everything we do is fundamentally derivative. There's not that many original ideas or actions out there. We all do it together all the time. And I think the daily experience of the internet reinforces that really strongly. And I'm really excited about that because one of the obvious aspects of that is the sense that everything should be free. And it's true. And as a cultural producer, I have to put an asterisk on that because it's not fair for only the artists and writers and musicians to go to be for everything for free while everybody else continues to get paid. But it is an interesting example of how much different life could be. So we got a little taste of that on an everyday basis when we're involved in all these different kinds of self-activities around the internet and social activity that's going on there. The chapter is much more intelligent and long-winded than I can be right now, so I'm going to just fly over that and tell you a little short story about Burning Man, which is there's also a chapter about. I imagine more than one of you here. I know one person here is a burner. I don't know if anybody else is. But Burning Man, I went out to in the early part of researching this book in 2002 and 2003. And you know, you've all seen the dry cleaners with a sign in the front that says 1 hour Martinizing. And I never knew what 1 hour Martinizing was, but I put a sign on my hat in the second year I went to Burning Man that said 1 hour Scrutinizing. And so people would run up to me, oh, I want to be scrutinized, I want to be scrutinized. I said, okay, great. You know, would you like light scrutiny or heavy scrutiny? And so if they wanted heavy scrutiny, they had to sit down and do a 45-minute interview with me. And so that interview was really interesting. It was actually the same set of 24 questions that I use over and over again for all these different activities. And you'll get in the book a lot more specifics from a lot of people involved in these activities. And so I would ask people like, well, you know, what's your relationship to technology when you're on your paid job all year long thinking about Burning Man? And then what is it like when you come to Burning Man and have a different life here? How are you reappropriating technology to your own purposes, et cetera? What is it like for you in terms of just your experience of work? What's it like to work at your job for money all year long and then come to Burning Man where you work like crazy to do all these amazing things? What is it like? And have people talk about that at some length. Then I would ask them, well, what does the word community mean to you? Are you part of a Burning Man community? Is it the whole place or just your camp or what is it? And so people all had lots of interesting things to say about that. And then I got to my favorite topic, which is class. And I would ask people, well, what does the word class mean to you? And I got every possible answer. You know, oh, it's like when you've got some class and you're stepping out in style, or that's when you're in a classroom and you're going to school, or you know, it's economic differences or whatever. People all had a different idea about it. And then I'd say, well, do you identify with the label working class or the label middle class or neither or both? And oddly enough, I got every possible combination over and over again. And then the next question, well, do you think there's a ruling class? And almost every single person, with only one exception, said yes instantly. And I just thought that was really a telling moment, because that's the story here in the United States, is that we all know we live in a class society that somebody else is running, not us. And when we're asked for what our own status is, we get confused. In fact, I didn't mention, but the body language of everybody, when I say, well, do you identify with this label or that label, or whatever, I typically would get this kind of wrinkled face and shrugged shoulders and, I don't know. My dad was, you know, a milkman, and my mom was a teacher, and I used to be a lawyer, now I'm making cappuccinos. I don't know, I guess I'm middle class, wannabe working class, or whatever. You know, it's just like a million different answers like that, but the really common physical reaction was uncomfortable. People were just really uncomfortable having to think about their own class status. But as soon as the question was, is there a ruling class? Yeah, of course there is, and I'm not it. That was obvious to everybody. So I thought that was very telling, and actually kind of informed the book to a certain extent as the research continued from there. So Burning Man ends up being a really fun experience for me. I think there's a lot more to be said about that too. Obviously Burning Man is just deeply contradictory. It costs a fortune to go now. It used to be practically free. So all of these activities are sort of fraught with contradictions in that way. The bicycling, anything could just turn into a small business at the end of the day, and then it's not so interesting anymore. So we're all faced with these issues over and over again, and how do we actually figure out how to break free is one of the dramas that the book is trying to point us towards. It doesn't really have the answer, because there really isn't one yet. It's something that we can only figure out together. But let me read you a quick conclusion, and then I think we'll still have another 10 minutes to talk, hopefully. Left enough time for a brief conversation at least. Okay, Nowtopians work in the invisible corners of daily life. Their projects, experiments, initiatives, and movements have solid roots stretching back to the mid-20th century, now spanning several generations of efforts to transform society. Grassroots, bottom-up, consultative, cooperative, innovative, consensus-favoring, open-minded, tolerant, all these qualities are common to many of Nowtopia's inventors and are distinctively uncommon in capitalist society. But it would be folly to note only the positive, liberatory, and hopeful qualities that underpin the Nowtopians. Irrational religiosity, self-righteous moralism, subcultural exclusivity, class and race unconsciousness, misanthropy, Malthusianism. Well, lists are easy to make. In describing the emergent Nowtopia, hiding all around us in plain view, I don't claim any certainty, historically or politically, that these specific efforts will survive. I hope also that my discussion of the contradictions each field faces makes clear that any of them can succumb to the pernicious logic of markets and money, and many of them certainly will. After all, Nowtopians are just folks who are a bit out front, moving ahead without institutional support to invent a more humane and ecologically sane world. Most Nowtopians have evolved skills with public discussion, group processes, and shared decision-making. Still, all the foibles, contradictions, vices, and confusions that beset anyone living in this mad world affect Nowtopians too. Nowtopia situates these behaviors in terms of the self-emancipation of the working class. I realize that few people think in such terms, but the point of this book is to place the efforts I describe in the social and historical context of early 21st century capitalism. The familiar understandings of labor, unions, even revolution, as derived from 20th century ideologies, are a dead end when it comes to the demands of social transformation in this era. By describing people who are making practical transformations and creating new communities in the practice of these activities, I see an emerging type of working class self-activity and, hopefully, self-consciousness. This is not to say that the simple accretion of more and more of these activities will by themselves make a new world. At some point, political power, the control of the state with its military and police, and the primary economic institutions of society becomes an unavoidable challenge to radical social change. These emergent fractions of a 21st century working class are not a vanguard. I am not suggesting Nowtopians are the new working class, nor that they alone can change the world. The old-fashioned industrial working class is larger right now globally than it has ever been. No meaningful transformation of life can happen without the engagement of many, if not most, of those global proletarians. But the old accommodations with state capitalism and social democracy that 20th century working class politics settled for are closed. Global climate change, war, crashing biodiversity, waste and industrial pollution, mass starvation, and epidemic disease are just the top of a long list of pressing reasons to radically change how we live on Earth. Our work together is shaped and driven by invisible hands and uncontrollable forces when it should be directed by us. Getting from the disparate experiments in work and technology and early stages of the new social communities that we see in Nowtopia to the big challenges ahead is an open and unknowable process of politics to come. Nowtopia, like utopia, is a no place. But unlike utopia, it is also an everywhere. It is appealing to imagine a harmonious and peaceful transition to a sensible, humane, and comfortable life for everyone. Nowtopian efforts are always, consciously or not, working in that direction. An unfolding potential can and does erupt in the most surprising places, seemingly simple and limited, but also embodying deeper aspirations for a more profound transformation. Our shared fate is bound up in our ability to consciously redirect our collaborative energies to a world of our own design. The experimental and tentative efforts that I've dubbed Nowtopia are stepping stones to a thoroughgoing reinvention of life. A politically savvy Nowtopia has yet to appear, but the foundations, already under construction for several decades, are solidifying and strengthening at least as fast as the planet is descending into chaos. Our tasks become more urgent the longer we delay the larger transformation that our local efforts promise and demand. Thank you very much. So, we have a few minutes for Q&A, I hope. Yeah.
There's always going to be jobs that nobody wants to do.
Our robot slaves, damn it.
Well, I think you could talk about intelligent use of automation for lots of things. That doesn't seem implausible to me. Of course, you have to radically alter how we use energy to get the end results. But I mean, take Amory Levin's work at the Rocky Mountain Institute with sort of a permacultural approach to industrial design, in which almost anything that we're currently doing in totally profligate and stupid ways, he's figured out ways to produce, or he and his group of friends and colleagues have figured out ways to do the same output with 80% less water and less energy, radically reduced inputs. And so it seems to me, if it was a social mission that we all got together to figure out, we'd figure out how to clean the toilets comfortably. And actually, I've written a novel over here. I'll have to plug that too, since you brought that question up, called After the Deluge, a novel of post-economic San Francisco. It's set 150 years in the future in San Francisco when the city's partially underwater, because like it or not, it's going to be. And there's a whole green city utopia has emerged. There's no longer markets and money. I wanted to write a story that would describe how these things get solved. And so I have a whole idea of how work could be arranged when we don't any longer arrange it around the buying and selling of human time. So the first thing is everybody has annuals to do. There's 60 hours a year. So there's these annoying signs everywhere that drives this teenager crazy, and he goes around setting fires. Because that's the drama of the book, is like, what does utopia do with bad behavior like an arsonist? So this angry teenager, because there'll always be angry teenagers, is setting fires. And one of the reasons he's setting fires is he hates these signs that are everywhere. It says, nobody wants to, so we all have to. Do your annuals. And it's only 60 hours a year. But that's too much for some people also. And then there's tryouts, and then there's apprenticeships, and then there's lifers. And there's different degrees of commitment along the way. And you can always leave, and even when you're a lifer, you can leave. But the premise behind it is that anything that needs to be done, somebody loves to do it. Probably a bunch of people. And they'll do it. Because they love to do it. If you said you could just do it, it's yours. We love that you love it, do it. And I think if we trusted every individual on the planet to make those kind of decisions, most of them would. Some of them will lay around and do nothing, but very few. Most people really want to contribute and pull their own weight and be part of a community and do something interesting and fulfilling. That's what we live for. And I don't think it's true that people are fundamentally lazy and capricious and just want to lay around and do absolutely nothing and live off the fat of everybody else's labor. I just don't believe that. I mean, obviously it's true under this system because most people are actually, the really wealthy are doing that. And they are the model that everybody else aspires to. So, the people who are left at the bottom of society are the ones that everybody seems to be afraid won't work hard enough. But that's the old model of, the fear factor in our society is such a strong piece of it. And we need to break the fear and build trust. And that's what I'm thinking is happening in these Nowtopian efforts, is that people are getting to know each other again, slowly, very rudimentarily, and through practical things like skill sharing. Like I'll show you, like you go in, I didn't mention the DIY bike shops, one of my favorite aspects of the outlaw bicycling subculture. We have the bike kitchen here in LA, and there's other ones in every city. And what happens is, I show up with my bike, the brakes are broken. I say, please, can you help me with my bike? Can you fix it? And they're like, we don't fix bikes here, but we'll show you how to fix your bike. Come on in. And we have the tools, and here's the stand, and this guy here will help you walk through the process of fixing your bike. And then pretty soon I know how to fix my bike. And then the next time I'm there and somebody else walks in, this 11-year-old black kid comes in, and he's got the same problem, and I can help you. And so how many times in our self-segregating world do we actually have those kind of meetings and those kind of conversations? And it starts out as tech talk. It's actually just that. But maybe it turns into something else, and the kid's never broken out of his neighborhood. And I say, well, let's go on a ride. I'll show you this great thing. And it's a whole side that you never heard of about the city, and there's this hidden river, and whatever. And so these kinds of spaces that are being opened by Nowtopians are spaces in which people come together in these new communities in ways that we are slowly rebuilding some kind of organic connections that might eventually become the foundation for a real radical change to the organization of life. That's the premise. We're a ways off from the final point. Yep.
So how do you see the sort of organic connections of Nowtopians sort of helped out by technology and other such things that sort of like how can technology be used to essentially sort of increase?
Well, I think it happens automatically on some level, that as you have the ability to find like-minded individuals through the phenomenon of blogging or internet chat rooms or whatever, there's a million ways that we start to discover people who are interested in the same things we are in ways that used to be really difficult to do. That facilitates that process. There's a tremendous fast circulation of new ideas and things. There's a list that I'm on called Think Tank Bikes. And it's all these DIY bike shops in constant conversation with each other about how they organize their collectives and what else could be going on and whether they should charge money or not. And all these different issues, like how do you deal with kids who are stealing things and everything else. And so these communities that are emerging, and another good example is the sustainable biofuels movement, which obviously is another larger story of capitalism coming in with Archer Daniels Midland and Chevron and saying, oh yeah, great, we can do this with soybean, and everything else. But the grassroots movement, which starts earlier and really builds the demand for this alternative, still exists side by side or underneath that tidal wave of capital. And it's through the internet that a great deal of technological skill sharing has taken place. People found out about trans-terrification because other people posted how to do it. And there's been this great proliferation of information like that. So I think those kinds of uses of both the communication technology to talk about technologies that you can actually start to implement are really important. We were talking at lunch about this phenomenon that's rising now called transition towns, and there's actually a Ning site called Transition California out there. And they're trying to build a social networking system where people who are interested in this problem of managing energy descent towards a more democratic life and a more wealthier life, frankly, a much wealthier life than the one we're living today, with far less energy and resource use and waste going on. It's spreading around the planet. It started in England, and it's just moving really quickly. How many people are getting excited about that? And I think that's kind of, even people on the right, there's a guy named John Robb who does a blog called Global Gorillas, which I recommend to everybody a lot because he's really smart on analyzing the sort of breakdown of the state. and the breakdown of centralized systems because of the phenomenon of international criminal syndicates and global guerrillas who very small numbers of people can bring down whole states through systematic sabotage of the infrastructure. Infrastructure is super fragile. So the answer for that is resilient communities, and even the guy on the right is coming to that position, and he starts linking people up on his blog to like open farm tech, where you can go and see how to build a tractor, or how to build your water pump, or whatever you need to build. So there's ways in which the technology is already being used to make transparent the transitional technologies and the ability to create social structures around using them that I'm really excited by. I don't see them as an automatic answer. I want to also flag, thanks for the question, and I want to flag that Americans are somewhat prone to thinking there's always a techno fix for everything. And I think most of what I'm trying to argue is that things can't really be solved by technologies. They can be solved by humans making good decisions about how we live together and what we want to do. And once we've decided where we're going and why we're here, like it seems to me we should be here to have a good life for everyone on the planet, then we might start implementing technologies that lead to that, instead of implementing technologies first and saying, oh, look, it's producing a good life, isn't it? Isn't it? Well, kind of, sort of, sometimes, but not for everybody. So we're kind of having the cart before the horse right now, and I think if we put technology back into the back of the horse where it belongs, we might actually be able to make good use of it. Yep.
Sorry, I came in a bit late, and I think I missed your discussion of class, but it sounded like you were positing that class consciousness was sort of an outdated concept, that trying to build class consciousness was a dead end. And so I'm wondering how you see these DIY communities becoming anything more than subcultural anomalies of, basically self-managed. I saw you had a quote from Steve Wright on the back, his term self-managed poverty. How do you get beyond self-managing your dropout from the system where you're not getting any benefits and you're marginal, and actually start to build counter?
Good question, very good question. I mean, a little bit jammed together, because I think the class consciousness issue, I think people are developing class consciousness, but it's not the one that we see in the rearview mirror where the people walk through the streets with red flags and marched around in the ways they once did. They call it community these days. And they're really interested in that. And everybody's really urgently needing it and growing it as best they can in their activities, is growing a sense of community and reliability with the people around them. And I think it's obviously still in its nascent moments. It's not like, oh, it's sweeping the planet and it's changing everything and capitalism's on its deathbed. Oh, maybe it is, but not because of that yet, although we can hope that will contribute to it. I think all of these kinds of efforts suffer that exact drama that you just said quite well about, self-managing poverty or leaving ourselves stuck in these kind of marginal little do-it-yourself ghettos in which we are, giving each other massages freely. That's lovely. It makes my life better. I like getting massages, but is that changing the world? No, not really. I mean, it's changing the relationships and the actual physical health of the people doing it, and that's important. You don't want to denigrate that, right? We need those are the building blocks from which the larger changes come. If you don't have that, you surely aren't going to get that. So that's what I'm arguing, is that we're in a moment in history, that's the part you missed, I guess, at the beginning, in which the decomposition of the class has been so successful from a capitalist point of view that we're really atomized. We barely know anybody anymore. We don't know the people we work with or that we live near. We might make new connections with people on our affinities, and that's kind of what we see emerging mostly. But this kind of level of where we're constantly moving, and we don't keep a job very long. We hop sideways or upwards or whatever, some way or another, and we don't know the people we're around. And so how are you going to build relationships that can change the world, where you can actually argue about politics and argue about what it is we're going for, unless you kind of know each other over a period of time and develop trust? And so, that might eventually get the label class consciousness, but class consciousness has almost always been imputed after the fact, looking at various moments in history. Very few people that were in the streets in May '68 would have necessarily said, I've got class consciousness and that's why I'm here. That's just not how it works. So I'm interested in the kinds of sense of shared experience that people have, because I think that's the essence of class consciousness, is a sense of shared experience, that we have a shared predicament on the planet, we have shared solutions for it, and without them being shared, we're not going to get it done. As individuals, we can't solve the problem. And I do think that starts to emerge from these behaviors and these activities. Whether they get stuck into a cul-de-sac, mostly they do. Frankly, they do. But they're also the area in which the impetus towards some kind of broader liberation is bubbling. And people want it to go beyond that. And that we need to have these conversations and then find ways to take action based on them that do take it further. We haven't figured that out yet.
Do you think that there's a way to imbue these communities with a sense of their own existence as being contradictory to capitalism, the self-awareness of...
Well, that's why I wrote the book. Exactly. I mean, I want to advance the conversation for sure and make it more of a political discussion because Americans are totally allergic to politics. They think politics is what you do every 4 years, you know, pick an advertiser.
People resistant to that idea? Were they protected with their own niche as being just what they like to do?
Yeah, definitely. I have friends at the Bike Kitchen in San Francisco who I quoted liberally in that chapter, and they read it and they go, wait a minute, I'm not anti-capitalist. Why am I in your book? And then I would talk to them further, and they kind of would admit that a lot of what they're doing is inherently anti-capitalist because they are working outside of the market entirely, and you know, working with the waste stream of discarded bikes and to some extent the waste stream of discarded youth, and helping them find a way to have a practical and purposeful time together. And I think that's really subversive and vital and important, even if the people doing it don't think that way. And I think that's the reality of the moment we're in history, where people don't have a big, elaborate ideological explanation for their actions, and yet with the proper lens, you see that they actually are deeply subversive and have great possibilities. And we need to push that further. And one other issue, which your question, which I really love, by the way, kind of leads me toward is this notion of radical patience, something I've used around critical mass a bunch too, because there's all of us who do these things, whatever part of it we plug into or wherever we are, have a tendency to want it to go faster. You know, history seems like it's just lurching around. It goes this way or that way, but we want to, you know, kind of will it forward in the direction we believe in that will be better for all of us and for humanity and the planet itself. And that's fine. I don't think there's anything wrong with that urgent desire. But part of my aging brain, now that I'm in my 50s, is to recognize that history has its own pace. It takes as long as it takes, and you can want it to go faster really bad, and you can't do it. And you know, the old vanguard fantasy is that the willful, tiny group can make it happen, and we know where that leads. We don't really want that to happen in that way again. We would rather, I think, want to have everybody get on board to a very deliberative and rather painfully slow process, because that's how long it takes to get lots of people to do things together. So we're talking about a real shift in how society organizes itself, and it will take a lot of patience. So my little metaphorical story that I started to develop was the tortoise and the gangster, not the tortoise and the hare, because we're the tortoises, all of us who do the things that we do every day to try to make it better today. What can I do today? And I don't want to ever quit. You know, I got the patience. I know I'm not going to get to the end of this in my lifetime, probably. Maybe, who knows? It could happen 2 years from now for really great. I would love it, but chances are it won't be like that. And so does that make me not want to get involved or keep pushing? No, I'm ready to take those plodding, slow steps like the tortoise day in and day out down the path. I'm going to win the race eventually. It might not happen while I'm around, but my daughter will or whoever will. And who are we up against? We're not really racing with a hare anymore. We're racing with gangsters, people who will kill us if we get anywhere down this path. So I think that's one of the points of naivete about a lot of this stuff, is the easy fantasy that if we just keep doing these good things, everybody will end up being nice and good. And it's not going to be like that. People are going to try to kill us if we're successful. So we do need to take seriously that we're up against criminals who run states and criminals who run corporations, who kill people who stand in their way. And eventually, we'll have to defend ourselves from that onslaught if we're successful. And I think we can be successful to grow networks of trust and conviviality that just make life way better than it is. That's really that's why we should do it. It's like life can be radically better than this. This is a reduced, sorry shadow of how good life could be. And I mean, you guys have a little pocket in here that's a little better than most people's, but still, even here, I'm sure you could talk about alienation or anything else you like, in which ways in which it's not what it could be. And so I'm interested in that larger conversation that I think radicals for the most part have abdicated, which is to get a lot better at describing how much better life could be and why people should embrace change instead of being afraid of it. Because it gets better, not worse. We don't slide backwards, we go forward to something really far better than this. So, thanks for that. Any other thoughts or comments, rebuttals, angry denunciations? All welcome. Well, I guess we could call it a day at 2:15. Back to work.